Well, I'm going to get started. Welcome. Soon we'll have a few more people joining us, and I'm hopefully recording this to post on YouTube a little bit later on as well. Can you hear me? Please tap your screen if you can hear me. Or if my cinema. Thank you. That's excellent. If you are new to Periscope, then you can tap the screen to react. I'll ask you to tap the screen from time to time. And I just noticed my forehead's getting very hot there. There's also a chat function. If you want to send me a message as I speak, you can send me a message and just type it in, and I will respond to it as I go as well. So you have found Interp Training Tuesdays, and this is a program set up by my friend and colleague Nicole Can, who is a strong believer in professional development at any cost. So she is really good at coming up with ideas that people in the interpretive and visitor experience profession can do for very little cost to try to be in touch with each other and try to keep abreast of trends in interpretation. So to do all kinds of interpretive professional development. This is one of the things that Nicole has come up with. She asked me to present today based on a subject that I have written about recently on my own blog. And so I couldn't wait to say yes. So my name is Don Enright, E-N-R-I-G-H-T. The blog that I just mentioned is where I write about interpretation and visitor experience, and that is donenright.com. And I'm an interpreter. I've been an interpreter for a very long time. I'm just coming up to, this May 2nd will be my 34th anniversary of my first summer interpretation. 34 freaking years. I have been at it full time all that time, but I have been steadily an interpreter for 34 years, which means I started, of course, when I was 2. Now I freelance as an interpretive planner. I've worked in government, I've worked in private sector, I've worked in non-profit sector quite a bit, and now I'm an interpretive planner and interpretive writer. And this presentation is called, hi Clark, welcome. This presentation is called Finding Your Voice, and I'm not going to be speaking about vocal technique or vocal production, although that is an area that is dear to my heart, and I've done a fair bit of work in that field, because you can't be a frontline interpreter for long without working a little bit on vocal production. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about interpretive voice from another point of view. Interpretive voice is the way that you write and the way that you speak, and it is your choice of words, and it is the way that you come across as an interpreter. So it is very, very closely related to your interpretive style, but it's more than style. It gets into your choice of content, and it gets into your point of view on your content as well. And it's very much part of your persona as an interpreter. So what I've been trying to do over the last little while is do some reading and some thinking about what is an interpretive voice for interpreters as presenters and as writers. What are the things that define our voice? How can we as interpreters become more conscious of our interpretive voice? How can we identify the qualities of our voice that make our point of view and our voice unique? How can we then consciously adjust or manipulate our interpretive voice to make it more appropriate to a given target audience? And lastly, how do we reconcile our interpretive voice with the style and brand of the organization that we're representing? Because the organization we represent is important, obviously, unless you're an absolute solo freelancer. Interpretation is a mission-based process, so you've been hired as an interpreter to help realize the mission of your organization. And so your interpretive voice is going to have to be reconciled or subordinate to a certain extent. It's going to have to jive with the voice of your organization, and your organization might never have done any work consciously on identifying their interpretive voice or their interpretive style, which I think is a bit of an opportunity for you to try to influence or perhaps initiate that process. So what are the qualities that give you a voice as an interpreter? First of all, hello Lurler85. I love all these handles. Lurler, can I call you Lurler? Welcome. What are the qualities that establish your voice? Hello. There are, I think, a few really strong qualities that an interpreter has that define who they are and how they come across to their target audience. And I'm going to start probably with the toughest one and the most contentious one right now in our field. And that is the role of authority in your interpretive persona or your interpretive voice. And by authority, I don't mean whether you're in charge, although you are in charge if you have a high authority to some extent. I'm talking about authoritativeness. How much do you appear to know about your subject? Now that seems like a no-brainer. But if you're an interpreter, you've come up with this issue before. How much do I know about my subject? And how much do I appear to know about my subject when I'm speaking to my audience? And the thing about being an interpreter is we're never, ever experts in our subject matter, or very rarely are we experts in our subject matter. Have you ever heard of the Impostor Syndrome? Tap your screen if you've heard of the Impostor Syndrome. And tap your screen twice if you suffer regularly from the Impostor Syndrome. The Impostor Syndrome is something I think all interpreters deal with regularly. And that is the feeling that, oh my God, I'm standing in front of this crowd and they're all looking at me and I don't have a freaking clue what I'm talking about. And I feel like such an imposter. It's not unique to our profession. It's unique to every profession. Every professional rises to a level where they're suddenly suffering from the imposter syndrome. But it's particularly, I think, apt to talk about it in interpretation because we rarely have the privilege of talking about a subject in which we feel like we're experts. I've been doing this a long time, as I mentioned, and I still feel like an imposter. I can talk with some authority about birds. I'm a birder. I'm a big old bird geek. I can talk with some authority about orchids, marine mammals, but I end up talking about all kinds of crap that I don't know anything about. So your job as an interpreter is to stay 2 steps ahead of your audience, to anticipate the questions, and to present, and to acknowledge when you are an authority, when you're not. This idea of the authority of the interpreter, I just learned, has its roots that go back 2,400 years in the earliest history of rhetoric. Believe it or not. I was writing about this subject and talking about authoritativeness. How authoritative are you as an interpreter? How much do you know about your subject? And my friend and colleague, John Cole, is a pretty smart guy. He's an interpretive planner, writer, teacher, based out of Costa Rica, I think. And he said, Don, you're talking about ethos. In Aristotle's treatise on rhetoric, there are 3 qualities that influence your persuasiveness. And he said, the quality you're talking about right now is ethos. And I said, oh, really? No, I said, of course I am. I'm talking about ethos. But it's really fascinating because interpretation is persuasion. Interpretation is persuasive education, right? And so the art of persuasion goes back at least 2,400 years. And Aristotle said there's 3 factors that influence persuasion. There's pathos. Pathos is the emotional side. We know about that, right? Because for a living, we make emotional and intellectual connections. So the emotional side of what we present is the pathos. The content, the facts and the way we present them, that is your logos. Your logos is sort of the content, the way we present the facts, which leaves one more thing, which is the ethos. And ethos is not ethics. Ethos is the credibility of the presenter. The credibility of the presenter. I've struggled with credibility and authority a lot. Authoritative versus modeling inquisitive behavior, creating an atmosphere of wonder. This is the thing. This is why, thank you, CLK724. I wish I knew who you were, because that was a really interesting thing to say. Creating an atmosphere of wonder. So there's 2 strong threads in the philosophy of interpretation right now. One of them is the role of interpreter as sage on the stage, presenter, authority. The other is the role of interpreter as guide on the side, facilitator, right? Who can facilitate collective musing, collective sharing, collective thought, collective provocation on the subject. And in any good interpretation, I feel that there is a balancing act between the 2. There's a huge swing of the pendulum. When you've been in the business as long as I have, 34 years, there are trends. And one of the pendulum swings right now is back towards interpreter as facilitator. And that comes very much out of the United States national parks system. The Americans are very much taking the facilitator role, where the interpreter's job is to facilitate exchange and facilitate thought, where they're no longer the sage on the stage, they're the guide on the side. And so in that, when you have the interpretive voice of guide on the side, authority becomes much less important. You don't pretend to know everything about the subject. You are there to facilitate exchange on the subject. My feeling is that when I see a great interpreter who can facilitate thought, I think, holy crap, that's a good interpreter. That is somebody who is really doing what Tilden said of provoking thought, not instructing, provoking thought. My issue with the interpreter as facilitator is that sooner or later, somebody has to add some freaking information to the discussion. Otherwise, I'm just trapped in a YouTube comments section, and it's sheer hell. I don't want to go and pay an interpreter, either through my time, or through my tax dollars, or through my pocket money. I don't want to pay an interpreter who doesn't know anything about the subject. Somebody better be there who does. Otherwise, what the hell am I doing there? I can go look up any old wiki page on my own. I want an interpreter who can lead the facilitation by presenting some information. Is that unreasonable? If it's just an interpreter going, I don't know, what do you think? And leading this endless layman's corner, maybe I'm old school. I don't have much time for that, because so much of the internet now is nothing but the endless exchange of opinions without the injection of insight. I think that kind of sucks. So you have in interpretation now this trend of interpreter as facilitator where you don't need to be an authority, which is good, because interpretation is about facilitating thought. On the other hand, if you're working for an agency that presents history, you better know your site's history. If you're working for an agency that is, or a park that presents natural history, you should know some natural history. So you need to think before you get up and talk, hello, what is this about? You have just walked into a presentation about presenting with an interpretive voice, being conscious of your level of authority in order to present. So that's the authority axis. And now, when you look at good presenters in the world, you start to wonder about how high is their level of authority when they speak. Some people speak from a very, very high level of authority. One of them is, let's say, look at Carl Sagan. Look at one of my favorite writers, interpretive writers, is Dr. Olivia Judson. If you haven't read Dr. Olivia Judson, she's an evolutionary biologist who is a kick-ass popular science writer, Dr. Olivia Judson. She writes with authority. She knows what she's talking about. If you look at the opposite end of the spectrum with no authority, most journalists have to function from the point of view of no authority, where they don't have the resources to become subject matter experts. So when you watch a David Letterman, or you watch a Barbara Walters, or you watch a news reporter, they don't pretend to know about the subject. They ask. And there's an interesting thing you can do as an interpreter to increase your authority on a subject, which is kind of invoking other people's authority to build your argument. Okay, enough about authority. It's getting boring. Let's talk about one of the other axes to create an interpretive voice, and that is the formality axis. How formal are you when you speak? Do you plan your sentences? Do you compose your sentences? Do you write your sentences before you speak? Or do you improvise on the fly? Do you treat your audience as if they are family members or friends? Do you use familiar language when you speak to your audiences? Are you, hi, how are you? Or are you, welcome to the agency so-and-so? When you start to plot your formality on a scale of 1 to 5, it really starts to define who you are as a speaker. Think of David Attenborough. When he presents, he's quite formal. He's delightfully formal. Dr. Olivia Judson, when she writes, is somewhat formal. Then go to the other end of the spectrum. Who are some of the least formal interpreters, famous interpreters that you can think of? I think you've got, for example, the late, great Steve Irwin. Very informal. And medium authority. He knew his snakes and his other reptiles, for example. He knew his insects. He wasn't a scientist, and he didn't pretend to be. So he was medium authority, low formality. Whereas Attenborough might be medium authority, high formality. Carl Sagan, the astronomer, high authority, medium high formality. There's another thing that we can add when you're defining your voice, and what I'm hoping you can do as you think about these points is actually think about where you are on the spectrum. On a scale of 1 to 5, when you present, are you low authority or high authority when you present? Type it in the comments if you know offhand. When you tend to present, are you highly authoritative or are you low authority? Where are you in your formality? When you sit down with your audience, are you highly formal? Are you reserved? Or are you really, really informal? Hi, how are you? Fireside chat. What is your level of authority? The third thing that defines your persona, your personality, or your voice as an interpreter tends to be your energy level. I've always been, as an interpreter, a high energy interpreter. Especially when I was younger. I would let a lot of my energy do my talking for me. So I'd get up on the stage and be super high energy. It really works with family audiences. It really works with children's audiences. Hello, Nicole. Being high energy tends to get you places, and it tends to fill in when you're low authority and when you're on a shaky terrain with your own presentation or perhaps with your own script. You fill in the blanks with your energy. Energy is infectious. So when somebody has high energy and low formality, you tend to become a bit of a Bill Nye. Bill Nye, the science guy. He's high energy, low formality, but high authority. Bill Nye is, I don't think he's a professional scientist, but he has high authority and increasing, I think. He's establishing himself as a high authority in climate change, for example. So high authority, low formality, and very high energy equals Bill Nye, the science guy, basically. I was looking for people who are high formality and low knowledge and low energy. And they're really hard to come by. Interpreters don't tend to fall into that category. Watch Inside the Actor's Studio. There's the host of that show. His name is Lipton. What's his name? Lipton. He's amazing because he's such a nerd. He's relatively low energy. He's very formal. He reads everything from cards. He reads everything from recipe cards. He's high formality, low knowledge. He doesn't know anything about acting. He's very formal. He's low energy. And every serious actor on earth wants to be on his show. He's a phenomenal, phenomenal facilitator. He's incredibly talented, but he's low knowledge, low authority, low energy, high formality, and he gets away with it. It's remarkable. So I've started working as an interpreter. James Lipton, he's so awesome. Thanks, Nicole. He's an incredible facilitator, and it shows that you don't have to be the star of the show to be a great interpreter. You can facilitate as long as you've got somebody there with you who can inject the insight, inject the knowledge, inject the information into the presentation. So 3 axes. You've got the authority axis. How authoritative are you as a presenter? How authoritative do you choose to be? How formal are you as a presenter? And how energetic are you as a presenter? Those 3 things will define your interpretive voice. So when I get up in front of certain audiences, I make a conscious effort. For example, I work on, he's also a great acting teacher. I didn't realize that. I don't know his history. When I get up as an interpreter with one of my audiences, I do presentation on cruise ships for part of my year. And that audience on cruise ships expect me to be an authority. And I work really hard at establishing my authority. I talk about subjects that I feel comfortable as an authority on. And I work on what differentiates me from all the other cruise ship speakers is I'm less formal, I'm more energetic, and I'm funny. And that's another thing that will qualify your interpretive voice, as particularly in certain settings with certain audiences, is your use of humor. People like it when they can laugh during your presentation. It's not always appropriate. Good interpretation can be very serious, can be deeply emotionally moving. It can even be deeply emotionally troubling. But on a cruise ship, where people are on vacation and they come to your quote-unquote lecture, expecting me to be an authority on a subject, and they discover that my energy is high and my formality is low, but I can still have high authority and I'm funny, I can make them laugh. Suddenly, I've got sellout crowds because I've made a choice to craft an interpretive voice that works for that audience. So that's where I'd like to, I think, conclude this presentation, is with the idea that once you start to define your voice or your personality as an interpreter, and try to discover where your comfort zone is, where you feel most effective, where you think you're doing your best job as an interpreter. I have 2 pigeons trying to nest on the balcony in front of me right now, and it's really distracting. Never work with children or animals. This poor female pigeon laid an egg on my balcony, and I thought I better put an end to that right away because it's not going to end well with my building management. So now she's back and she's just looking at me. She's like, "You bastard, you took my egg." And I'm going to try to ignore her as a good interpreter. That once you understand how you can craft your voice, you can make choices about your interpretive voice for your target audience. When you're working with families, for example, not children, but families, you better have an interpretive voice that appeals to both the adults and the children in your audience. You better have enough authority to appeal to the audience, to the adults in the group. You better have a sense of humor that works for both children and adults in the group. I call it Shrek humor. When you're working for a family audience, you send half the humor to the kids, and then you send half the humor right over their heads to the adults in the audience. And that's how you craft a voice that works with family audiences. So once you understand the factors that influence your voice as an interpreter, then you start to make choices. Today, I'm going to ramp down the authority because this program isn't about authority. This program is about stimulating thought. Today, I'm going to ramp up the formality in my presentation because I have an audience that needs it at this point in order to stay coherent and organized. I'm going to ramp up the energy in my presentation today because if I don't, I'm not going to make it to the end of this presentation. You start to identify those and make conscious choices about them. The last factor, of course, that figures into your interpretive voice is what is the interpretive voice of your agency or your organization or your site. And in this, interpretive voice is very closely related to brand. And brand, I hesitate to use the term because it's a bit of a hot button term because when we think brand, we think marketing, we think look and feel, we think swooshes and big golden arches and stuff like that, but that's not what I mean when I refer to branding. I'm not talking about look and feel. Look and feel is the very last and least important aspect of branding. Branding is the way that you appeal to your audience. Branding is literally the impression you make on your audience. That's the definition of brand. So your organization's brand is the impression that your organization makes on its audience. Your brand, and you have one, is the impression you make on your audience. So your interpretive voice is very much part of establishing your brand, the impression you make on your audience. When you do a branding exercise, if you do it right, your brand becomes a manifestation of your values, especially in our business, especially when you're in a mission-based environment, particularly in the nonprofit sector. Your brand is a manifestation of your values. And if you work for an organization that is trying to slap a brand on itself that isn't in keeping with its actual values, the brand fails, the brand collapses. It's putting lipstick on a pig, and I've been there, I've seen it. But when you have a brand that is a manifestation of your values, then suddenly you've got integrity. And when you're developing your brand, either as an individual or as an organization, you actually define your brand personality. I've worked for 2 agencies that have been through a branding process where we defined brand personality. One of them chose, I don't know if I can remember them all, the brand personality was welcoming, cheerful, knowledgeable, proactive, somebody else help me out here, and there are a couple other qualities, and they were really useful, particularly the first 2. If the only one you can remember is welcoming and cheerful, because there are days when you're in uniform and you don't feel very welcoming and cheerful, but you Acknowledge that you're working in uniform for an agency, and this agency has made a conscious decision that in everything we do, we're going to be welcoming and cheerful. Wow, that's great. That's great. I can fake that if I'm not feeling it. I can fake that. And what I like about having to manufacture a personality for the first part of my day is that if I really invest in it, I actually start feeling it after a while, because it comes back to you from the audience, right? The welcoming and cheerful part comes back to you, and suddenly you realize, oh yeah, I actually like this work. I actually feel cheerful again. Another agency I worked for had two of the pillars of its brand were interesting. Two of the pillars of its brand were diplomatic and credible. And that was really valuable because it was a nonprofit that worked in sometimes a difficult political environment. And a lot of the staff and volunteers felt that we had a very strong advocacy role. So when something happened in the community that really triggered our outrage, we would want to go in with guns blazing, make strong statements to the public. And the board and the executive director had made a strong decision. No, that's not us. That's not us. We are diplomatic and credible. So take your outrage and channel it through a voice that is diplomatic and credible. And that's how our organization gets things done. That was a hard pill to swallow sometimes. And that gets to an interesting point where you discover sometimes that your voice and your organization's voice don't always overlap. It puts you in a difficult position. I would say that for me, a big part of my career, my very long career, has been spent trying to find a setting, a park, an organization, an agency, whose values overlapped strongly with mine. And then you try to create a relationship with your audience where you find that sweet spot where you have this incredible, if you can picture a Venn diagram of your values, your agency's values, and your audience's values coming together, where you actually have an exchange, where you have an interplay of thought and an interplay of insights. That's pretty exciting. That's a pretty incredible environment in which to work. And I think that if you can't reconcile your voice and your interpretive personality with that of your agency, you've got a problem. You've got an untenable situation on the long term. So if you don't know what your agency or your site's interpretive voice is, or if you don't know what your organization's brand personality is, it's an opportunity for you to try to define it. There are some exercises that you can go through as a group engagement process to say, who are we? Who are we? Are we cheeky? Are we engaging? Are we funny? Are we irreverent? Are we authoritative? Are we knowledgeable? Are we provocative? Are we... I spent an entire half day just gathering adjectives that you can use, print on a sheet, and throw onto a table and start to fight over. This is who we are. No, we're not. We're that. This is who we are. No, we're that. Not, we're not. We're familiar. No, we're formal. No, we're funny. No, we're... It's really good. I can send it to you. If you contact me through my blog, I can send you that list of adjectives, and you just sit there and fight over it. We did an exercise recently through another organization where, as a group, we got together just for our writing style, our writing voice. We threw these adjectives on a table, and we discovered that we had consensus in our group over our writing voice, except one individual was completely at odds with the rest of us over the way our voice should be articulated, and it was one of our writers. And that is not an unsurmountable problem, but it's a great red flag. And it's a great thing to learn early in the process. We don't have consensus on our voice, and we need to get it. We need to get consensus on our voice. It's a really cool exercise to do. So I encourage you, with the idea of voice, to talk to your colleagues and say, how authoritative are we? How energetic are we? How funny are we? How familiar or formal are we? What adjectives? Can we come up with 7 adjectives that describe us? In everything we do with our public, we are welcoming, cheeky, forward, reserved, diplomatic, mature, youthful, frank, circumspect. If you're a wordsmith, the fun never stops. And see if you can come to consensus. If you can come to consensus and that voice starts to gel over a year or two, then you can start evaluating your programs against that voice. You can even start hiring your interpreters and your writers and all of your frontline staff against that voice. What potential do these people have to realize our voice and bring it to life for our audience? And then suddenly you have an integrity to your visitor experience, where you don't have one interpreter yelling at people with a voice of authority and another interpreter facilitating people with a calm guide on the side point of view, unless you made a conscious decision that is appropriate given a certain setting and audience. That's my presentation for today. If I've done this right, I will place this on either my YouTube channel or Nicole Cahn's YouTube channel, probably Nicole's, and I'll link to it. Stay tuned, and I look forward to your feedback if you've got it. And I thank you for joining me today on my very first ever Periscope broadcast. Thanks very much, everybody. Ciao. Thanks, Nicole. She's going to put it up tonight. Woohoo! If I recorded it. Hey. Bye-bye.